I think that one of the most interesting things about both Christianity and Islam is that they both predict their own demise. I mean, on paper you'd think that religions that were supposedly spawned via the direct revelations of God would be infallible, but no. They both speak of a time that goes by many different names, such as the Last Day, the Day of Judgment, Akhir al-Zaman, or the term that I most prefer, the End Times. It is said that during such end times there will be barely any religious men of faith remaining whatsoever, and that life on earth will very much resemble hell itself. Here, all of humanity will be ruled over supremely by a demonic figure known in Christianity as the Antichrist, or in Islam as the Dajjal, who will oppress mankind, drowning us all in sin. That is, of course, until the inevitable return of Jesus Christ, who both Christians and Muslims believe will slay his nemesis and liberate mankind back onto the divine path, thus restarting history and beginning a new era. But I'm not going to talk about that today. As today I don't want to talk about what will actually happen during the end times themselves, but instead, what are the supposed prophesized signs to look out for before they actually happen? And what makes Islam specifically so unique here is just how descriptive their signs are. Islam has a plethora of end-time signs that aren't, as you may expect, vague, minimal, or easily misinterpreted, but on the contrary, precise, sharp, and to the point. Islam has two types of end-time signs: major signs and minor signs. Major signs occurring much closer to the end times, and minor signs occurring much earlier. Thus, you're probably expecting me to cover the major signs, as after all, being major, they must surely be more interesting. But no, because yes, while they are certainly interesting, I'd describe the major signs of the end times as being quite celestial in nature, as they're things like the sun will rise from the west and fall in the east, a great smoke will engulf the earth, and there will be 3 landslides, one in the east, one in the west, and one in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, as grandiose as these signs are, there's really just not much to say about them, as unless one believes in Islam already, such great declarations of cataclysmic events will likely just unveil dismissal. What I think will resonate much more with people is actually the minor signs. As whereas the major signs are most celestial, the minor signs focus more on we the people, with the state of our societies, politics, and religious affinities. When I first read these minor signs of the end times for the first time, I was absolutely blown away with how much it seemed like they were writing about our modern Western society. As to be clear, all of these prophecies were written, 10 years ago? Nope. 100 years ago? Nope. 1,000 years ago? Nope. But over 1,400 years ago. A world so much more different to our own that we can barely even comprehend it. Today, I want to go in depth with just 10 of these prophecies with you, and we're saving the best for last. And as I read them to you, in the back of your mind, I want you to compare these signs to what our modern Western society is like today. So without further ado, let's begin. Number 1. Naked, destitute, barefoot shepherds will compete in building tall buildings. Tall buildings, you say? Now, looking past the fact that tall buildings like skyscrapers didn't really exist 1,400 years ago, making this a beyond unusual prediction right off the bat, as it just so happens, today, many of the nations of Arabia, such as Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and the quintessential home of Islam, Saudi Arabia, tend to have a reputation for being incredibly wealthy. But this wasn't always the case. In fact, much of the wealth gained in this region has been a relatively recent phenomenon. For example, if we look at this photo of Dubai in 1990, you can see that it was essentially just a desert with a few high-rises. Fast forward to 2008, however, and it's become a booming city. Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce you to the power of finding oil. In Qatar, petroleum accounts for 85% of all export earnings, 70% of government budget revenue, and 60% of the nation's total GDP. A story that is likewise similar in Saudi Arabia as well. In fact, would you believe me if I said that the economy of the United Arab Emirates has grown by 231 times over since 1971? Which is, needless to say, unbelievably huge. From the discovery of such vast oil came significant economic importance within the world's economy that the region has successfully managed to use to its leverage via diplomatic trade. This prophecy predicted that one day the Arabian nations would become wealthy, as they have, whereby they would then compete in building tall buildings with their newfound wealth. And, as it just so happens, at the time of recording, the world's tallest building is none other than the Burj Khalifa in the United Arab Emirates. A most unusual coincidence. Now, while there's nothing wrong with building such grandiose buildings, it is somewhat sad to see such countries undergo such futile vanity projects at the same time as other Islamic countries, such as Yemen and Afghanistan, are so utterly deprived. Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia both have a population of roughly 38 million people at the time of recording, and yet Afghanistan has a GDP of just 72 billion, whereas Saudi Arabia has 2 trillion, more than 20 times higher. Needless to say then that the worldwide Muslim Ummah, which is meant to be one united force, isn't so united anymore. And I suppose that's the entire point of the prophecy, to showcase how being blessed with wealth in this life ultimately leads to a spiritual disconnection, and a focus on the material. A similar phenomenon to what we've also seen over here in the West throughout recent decades as well. Sad. Which brings us on to number 2. People will boast to each other with the construction and decoration of mosques. A big difference between Christianity and Islam is the philosophy behind places of worship. Over here in England, you'll have these disgusting hobbit houses surrounding a beautiful masterpiece of a church in practically every hamlet imaginable. I admittedly have a bit of an obsession with stained glass windows, so I may be a little biased, but I genuinely believe that churches are some of the most beautiful buildings that the Western world has to offer. And it makes sense why, as in Christianity, churches were intentionally made to be as beautiful and grandiose as possible, as a means to show dedication to God. Some Christian cathedrals even took multiple lifetimes just to finish, such as the Notre Dame Cathedral in France that took almost 2 centuries to complete, from 1163 to 1345. And I thought building my Minecraft house took a long time. But whereas in Christianity, churches are meant to be grandiose, in Islam, there is an entirely different philosophy, as mosques, contrary to popular belief, are actually meant to be simple. In mosques, you can have no images, statues, or anything even slightly resembling illustration of life. On the contrary, they are designed in such a way to be rather abstract. The reason being that mosques are intended purely to be a place of worship to God and God alone. It's the same reason why one is not meant to illustrate any of the Islamic prophets in any way, as Muslims don't want to make false idols out of men, objects, or anything other than God. That and the fact that decorating a mosque so much is somewhat against the Islamic idea of modesty, as a place of worship is not meant to awe believers, but unite them on their quest to please God. To Muslims, the mosque is a mere backdrop, a house dedicated to God, but not wholly in of itself. While this prophecy predicts that mosques will become needlessly grandiose, it actually made me think retrospectively about the fate of many Christian churches. As all throughout the Western world are these beautiful buildings that used to be packed with worshippers, yet are now but empty and barren. Their beauty still remaining, but their purpose being relegated from being the focal point of a local community into something more akin to a museum. Proving the very important point that it doesn't matter how beautiful you make your place of worship if the faith is so weak that no one actually worships in it. Sad. Which brings us on to number 3. Women will be dressed but undressed, inviting to evil, and they themselves will be inclined to it. Okay, so the story goes like this. The Islamic prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him of course, underwent a vision of hell. And in hell, he reported to see women that were, quote, dressed but undressed. Meaning that they seemed to wear clothes, but there was so little covering them that they may as well have been naked. This was quite a confusing vista for the prophet, however, as no woman really dressed in such a way during his time. Not the Romans, not the Arabs, not the Chinese, no one. Hence, it was assumed that such women were a sight from the future. You see, all throughout human history, women have understood the feral animalistic nature of man and covered themselves as to not be objectified and treated as mere meat. Recently I was looking back at some ancient photos of my ancestors, supposedly from the late 1800s, and something that surprised me is that all of the women were veiled. This was back in Christian 19th century Britain, and as much as it may surprise you, dear viewer, such views on modesty were almost universal, even back here, back then. Yet fast forward to today, and covering up one's beauty has seemingly become synonymous with Islam exclusively. Because here in the once Christian, now secular Western world, as hard to believe as it may be, women have actually been made to believe, by very mischievous men, that dressing modestly is actually considered a form of oppression, and that on the contrary, showing off one's body like some sort of product is actually liberation. Now, it doesn't take a genius to understand why men would want to see women dress in a more revealing fashion, but when even women can be convinced to celebrate immodesty, that simply goes against human nature, and can only be described as depressing. Many women have unwittingly become the cheerleaders of their own exploitation. Falling for the freedom meme, the amount of young women who are treated like objects has never been higher in human history than today. Brainwashed from their earliest days to feel flawed, buying product after product to attempt to fix problems that don't even exist, with their confidence utterly in the toilet. Long gone are the days of self-worth, confidence and modesty, and with the now trashed institution of marriage, many women find themselves losing their virginities to men who only care for their bodies. And the consequences for society of this has been evil beyond belief, such as fatherless children, or God forbid, murdered ones. Allow me to issue a fatwa. I believe that those witnessed in that hellish vista were those of the most wicked of modern Western civilization. For we today see those who fit the description of being dressed but undressed, inviting to evil, and they themselves being inclined to it. It cannot be understated the amount of respect I have for the few remaining women who dress modestly, as well as the few remaining men who act righteously towards them. Though perhaps as people slowly learn how Islam has predicted such a decline, we may just start to see such upright mindsets become much more common again. Just we continue to bathe in mutual immodesty. Sad. Which brings us on to number 4. Men will imitate women, and women will imitate men, with commerce and business increasing significantly until a time comes when a woman assists her husband. I mean, does this one even need an explanation? Whereas throughout history, men and women have each had a clear designated purpose that made us both pleased, as I've said many times before, ever since the introduction of feminism, the lines between man and woman have become blurred. The immutable concepts of masculinity and femininity still exist, of course. They are just intentionally pushed in reverse. Men are told to act feminine, show their emotions, and don't be ambitious, whereas women are told to act masculine, forgo the concept of family, and be a #girl boss. Both of which sentiments have resulted in men and women finally becoming equal. Equally unhappy, that is. It's almost like the distinction between men and women exists for a reason. That we were each made to excel at a certain role, none outright superior or inferior than the other, but two sides of the same coin. A coin that we have now smelted under the delusion of equality. Men's lowering of labour value and women's forceful introduction to the workforce has utterly destroyed Western society for the masses. Now, men and women are no longer by default natural partners, but unnatural competitors, in a game that only the wealthy truly win. Birth rates are down, whereas depression is up. Generational wealth is down, whereas income inequality is up. Home ownership is down, whereas the divorce rate is up. And though the ignorant are unaware, the root cause of all of these problems was, of course, the feminist movement. And the fact that revelations from over 1,400 years ago predicted the devastation that such a modern movement has provided can only be described as truly spine-chilling. Sad. Which brings us on to number 5. Trustworthiness will be lost as authority is given to those who do not deserve it. Question. When I say the word politician, what descriptors come into your head? Probably words like trustworthy, cool, awesome, amazing, inspiring, and geniuses, right? On the contrary, it's probably words like thief, rat, criminal, disappointment, fool, and liars. Politicians are, after all, for the most part, absolute self-serving cretins who consistently poll to be the least trusted profession on the planet in modern times. And is it really any wonder why? Whereas in the past, the leaders of nations were meant to be the bravest and most valiant amongst their people, now we are led by corporate cutouts in suits. It cannot be put into words the utter disdain that every single person in the West should have for our politicians. The Boris Johnson cabinet of the UK was perhaps the finest example of how a nation could sink into such foulness. A man renowned for being a serial adulterer, who somehow worked his way into the top job. Not that he was the only one, however, as his health secretary was also caught red-handed, snogging another bird behind his wife's back. Is it really any wonder that people no longer trust their governments? If they can't even stay loyal to their own wives, how the hell are they going to stay loyal to you? Leaders such as this are naught more than symbols of national humiliation, and a testament to how the worst of men can rise to the top when the righteous are too busy sitting on their hands. It doesn't matter whether these criminals call themselves left-wing or right-wing, as one day their bird of deception will have no wing. For mark my words, the fury that people have for politicians today is merely the tip of the iceberg, and the Titanic known as the people's rage will one day hit such with a vigour unrivalled throughout human history. And hopefully this Islamic reminder of the importance of morality in leadership may just help sow such a moral consciousness. As it's not hard for a godless nation to be led by a devil, but it would take a miracle for a God-fearing nation to be so. Or oil. That works too. Nevertheless, unless we in the West choose to stop being willingly led by these faceless suit politicians, who are truly the worst amongst us, then we will never begin to rejuvenate our societies and attempt to reach nirvana once more. Sad! Which brings us on to number 6. A man will pass by the grave of another and wish he was in the latter's place. There has never been a time in human history where people, especially young people, feel more unfulfilled than now. There is a rising crisis in the Western world of young people with their entire lives ahead of them choosing to end their own lives because they think they'd be better off dead rather than live the life that they've been given. The amount of people who I've heard say things like they wish they would have been born in their parents' or grandparents' generation because life would have been so much easier for them is astounding. As considering that with all our advanced technology, an abundance of food, and an endless array of affordable products to consume, that you'd think that surely people would be happier now. But no, because it isn't products that make human beings truly happy, but people. And the bonds between people today are weaker than ever, as the modern human being has been brainwashed to believe that they are not first and foremost part of a collective society, but merely an individual, whose purpose it is to work, consume, and then die. A society so profoundly depressing that millions of people voluntarily take a consumable pill just to get through the day, rather than actually addressing the elephant in the room of how we've completely demolished our community interactions. Because nothing screams a healthy society like youth suicides, high depression rates, and record-breaking levels of medication. Welcome to progress. Sad. Number 7. The drinking of alcohol will become very common. I mean, of course it is. My home country of the UK has a major problem with alcohol, with it being the leading cause of death among under 50s. And of course, it's often in the poorest parts of the country, such as here in the neglected north, who suffer the most deaths related to it. Primarily, one imagines, as it's mostly poor people who like to distract themselves with such a vice, rather than actually dealing with the problems making them so depressed in the first place, due to a lack of resources. Alcohol is, after all, an effortless poison that temporarily lowers one's IQ to the point whereby you become a bumbling buffoon, and thus feel like you aren't burdened with your problems anymore. Well, until you wake up the next day with a headache beyond comprehension. Imagine drinking something so unhealthy that it takes your entire body a whole day just to get over it. In the wise words of Mr. Gene, man seeks to escape himself in myth and does so by any means at his disposal. Drugs, alcohol, or lies. Unable to withdraw into himself, he disguises himself. Lies and inaccuracy give him a few moments of comfort. If only there was some sort of group that warned against these behaviours. A group whose holy texts warn that while there can be some good in alcohol, the bad far outweighs it, and thus in order to have a healthy society, it must also be a dry society. If only. But hey, I'm sure this culture of working a miserable job you hate for 5 days a week, only to spend the remaining 2 days of your free time zombified in an infantile state, will no doubt collectively work out great for us all. Sad. Number 8. Time will pass more quickly. Now this could be taken 2 ways. The first metaphorically, meaning that we can now do things so much quicker due to our advancements in technology, or secondly, literally, meaning that time actually feels like it moves quicker the closer we get to the end times. This one's pretty strange, to be honest with you, because the amount of people who have come to me and said, hey, doesn't it feel like time is moving quicker? And yes, I agree, it does. Thus, I did a poll whereby I asked you all, does it feel like time is passing quicker now, or is it the same? A staggering 75% said that it feels like time is passing quicker now, with just 25% saying that it feels the same. And that was with no context at all. Now I know the argument of, oh, but time is relative, so the older you get, the quicker it seems to fly. But that's boring. No. I'd much rather believe that a 1,400-year-old prophecy is true, because that's way more cool and interesting, thank you very much. Though with that said, I'm not too pleased if so, as life passing quicker isn't exactly a good thing. Can you believe that 2022 was 20 years ago? Sad. Number 9. There will come a time when there will be no one left who does not consume usury, and whoever does not consume it will nevertheless be affected by it. Usury is the act of lending money and charging interest on top of it. According to CNBC, the average American has over $90,000 US in debt, and this burden permeates throughout every generation, with Gen Z having an average of $9,000. Millennials with an average of $78,000, and Gen X with an average of $135,000. Truly staggering figures, but it really shouldn't be that surprising, as the entire economic system in the Western world revolves around banks lending money to people with added interest on top. For example, you need a bank account in order to store money, but you need a house in order to have a bank account. But you need a job in order to get a house, but you need a qualification in order to get a job. So you get in debt to get the qualification, so you can get a job to pay off the mortgage you have on your house, which you need to enjoy the privilege of having a bank account in order to store money that isn't even yours anyway, as you're in debt to the eyeballs. And before you know it, you're spending the rest of your life working away for things that the majority of the time you're even alive, you won't even own. Most people seem to be under the delusion that this is a completely normal economic system, but it isn't. In fact, up until very recently, historically, usury was completely forbidden across much of the Christian world. In fact, there's quite the irony in that Jesus Christ himself would be patient with people like prostitutes, thieves, and even murderers, but the only profession that he ever got truly enraged with was with moneylenders and money changers. Oh, and did I mention that our money, that being fiat currency, is based on nothing? That it could theoretically lose all of its value overnight because the only thing that actually gives such currencies their worth is that people think that it does. What an amazingly stable system. It's not an understatement to say that the Christian failure to fight usury as an economic system has been completely and utterly paramount. If only there was another book of sorts that warned in no uncertain terms that usury should be prohibited, that charity should be promoted, and all currencies should be linked to something tangible. As perhaps then we wouldn't live in a world where the top 1% of society hoards unimaginable levels of wealth unnecessarily. Sad! And last but not least, with number 10. The Muslim conquest of Rome. Now this one really interests me. The Muslim conquest of Rome, the capital city of Italy, may seem upon first glance like an unusual revelation, but not so much when you know the historical context. As Europeans, back in the time when these prophecies were written, used to be referred to en masse simply as Romans. Thus, Rome is not necessarily referring to the city of Rome, but on the contrary, the continent of Europe. For millennia, Western Europe was a Christian stronghold, yet in the 20th century came many experimental ideologies that wished to usurp it, such as fascism, which essentially died with the defeat of the Axis powers in World War II, communism, which essentially died via the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the Cold War, or neoliberalism that spawned from both their deaths, that being the unholy combination of social progressivism and economic conservatism. The people of Western Europe thus had a clear choice: to stay with Christianity or to adopt neoliberalism, and unfortunately for them, they picked the latter. But neoliberalism, unlike Christianity, is not a civilization, but an abomination, whose elite have made the fatal error of choosing to demonize its men, enslave its women, and neglect its children to enrich themselves. The modern West has thus become godless, weak, and doomed to collapse. Such is the verdict of civilizational natural selection, as I have predicted. The question is not whether neoliberalism will die, but what will replace it. And well, it's no secret that Islam has soared in numbers across much of Western Europe over the last few decades. To take my home country of the UK for example, in 1971 there was just 226,000 Muslims and just 30 mosques. 20 years later in 1991 and there were 950,000 Muslims and 442 mosques. 20 more years later in 2011, and there were 2.7 million Muslims and 1,500 mosques. Absolutely staggering levels of growth in a minuscule amount of time. Such numbers are also similar across much of Western Europe, and the reason for such huge growth is because under neoliberalism, European nations can't even function without such immigrants. As how can a continent with such a low fertility rate possibly keep alive its public sector services with such a rapidly aging population? It can't. Like a child, Europe has become reliant on others just to stay afloat. A self-inflicted wound of complete and utter stupidity. Many neoliberals thought that by bringing Islam to Western Europe, that they'd be able to take advantage of cheap labour from Islamic nations and slowly over time dilute Islam just as Christianity was, creating an enhanced labour force of consumerist disposable drones. Little did they realise, however, that they were very wrong indeed, as contrary to being diluted, Islam has seemingly remained resolute and is thriving beyond comprehension. Partially due to its own innate success, and partially because the conservatives, Christians, and nationalists of Europe have been suppressed by their neoliberal oppressors and their progressive, useful idiots. Contrary to popular belief, if Islam wishes to become the dominant religion in Europe, its followers need not spread it by violent means, such as by bullet, tank, or missile, but diplomatically, by handshake, book, and womb. For it is the Muslims who have not just prophesied the soulless society we live in today, but is seemingly the only faction with the unwavering resolve to fix it. A revelation that is no doubt a tough pill to swallow for many, and if proven true, shall be as painful of a transition as much as it was an unnecessary one. I won't pretend as if Islam was my first choice in fixing the issues we have today. However, if it is truly the only way to purge the consequences of neoliberalism and usher in a new era of righteousness, then it is a way that has no choice but to be adopted. Jest we rot in the filth of godless decadence ad infinitum. Sad. Now, these 10 prophecies are just the ones I've spent the time to go in depth on, but rest assured there are plenty more that are definitely worth checking out. Things like, knowledge will be taken away and ignorance will prevail. Plagues and diseases that were never known among their predecessors will spread among them. The number of men will decrease while the number of women will increase until for every man there are 50 women. The slave woman will give birth to her master or mistress. And the nations of earth will gather against the Muslims like hungry people going to sit at a table full of food, and this will occur when the Muslims are large in number. Needless to say, I highly recommend everyone to research the minor signs of the end times in Islam for themselves, as I guarantee you will be most surprised at what you find. As whether you believe in Islam or not, what these prophecies really show is a fundamental understanding of what makes a successful society and what doesn't, serving as an eternal warning of what a decaying culture would look like. And the fact that such signs may resonate with us so much should really speak volumes about the state of our own. Alternatively, however, you can go on with your life under the false assumption that Islam is nothing more than a backwards religion with nothing to add to the world. But in that case, you'd probably be a sign yourself. Alright folks, I hope you enjoyed that. This one was a pain in the arse to edit. I hope you appreciate how much of a pain this was to edit. Can you tell? Because it really was. I already know one of the biggest criticisms that this will get is people will say, oh, but Alex, these end times prophecies, they're not from the Quran, they're from the Hadiths. And for those who don't know, if the Quran in Islam is like the direct word of God, the Hadiths are like less reliable human accounts of certain events, right? So it's not as reliable. But here's the thing, if the end times prophecies are mostly from the Hadiths, and the end times prophecies, as we've just seen, are pretty damn accurate, isn't that more impressive? How is that less impressive? It would be less impressive if it was in the Quran. The fact it's in the Hadiths, which is meant to be like unreliable and like, we're not quite sure if it's true or not. I mean, I think that's even more impressive myself, but hey, I don't know, for some reason people keep saying that as if it makes any sense. Anyone want to explain that to me? Because that makes no sense to me. Either way, I'm going to be honest, like when I first read these for the first time, the camera reenactment of me opening my eyes wide really wasn't that much of a reenactment. It was just like that because, yeah, it's hard to believe that these prophecies are so ancient. And as I say, it really is testament to just what a decaying society we live in the West. I say this a lot. I think that history books will talk about modern Western society that we're living in the early 21st century, similar to how people talk about the fall of Rome. Because I don't think there's ever been, in fact, the fall of Rome, you could say that they were quite inept, but they weren't. They weren't stupid. We're stupid. Like, what is going on in the Western world right now is stupid. We have an ideology, a religion, neoliberalism, that doesn't work, and people align to it, and it doesn't matter how much you lecture them about how much it's destroying society, they won't have any of it. There'll be a small subsection of people who watch this or listen to this or whatever, and they will just go, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, as if what I've just said doesn't make complete sense. As if it's not blatantly observable that Western society is decaying. Either way, if I start going on about this will end up a podcast, but besides the point, I find these end times fascinating. And all I say to people who are atheist or Christian or whatever, just because it's Islamic, don't hide from it, don't run from it. This is interesting, and you should look into it. That's all I ask. Nevertheless, I'd like to give a shout out to the Wall of Famers, specifically John and Kevin. Thank you to both, I very much appreciate it. Very charming as ever when people join. Nevertheless, folks, that was quite a strange one, quite a scary one as well. It's spine-chilling. But either way, hopefully it didn't make you too depressed. But nevertheless, I'll see you next time.